Wow, listen to that. Who remembers when? Oh, it wasn't that long ago. You know, one of my first things moving here in 1976 was to sell acoustic couplers for the telephone. So I remember when. Welcome to tonight's program. I'm Dan Lewin. I'm the CEO of the museum. I've been given a little bit of a script, and one of the notions here was for everyone to jump into DeLorean and hit the Wayback Machine. Because where we're going, we don't need roads here. So anyway, I want to thank our trustees. There are many here tonight. We had our annual board meeting today, and some former trustees who've been part of the museum for a long, long time. So thank you all for coming and all that you do. Also the staff and our AV crew for putting things together. We can't thank you enough. And tonight's program is particularly special. One of our new trustees, Dana Boyd, will be on stage. Dana comes with a wealth of experience in this arena and is not shy about the communications we'll hear tonight. Her book, It's Complicated, will be something that I'm sure will be referenced. If you haven't read it and you're interested in teens and social media, it's worth reading. The program tonight fits particularly well with the mission of the museum, which is to decode technology and its implications on the human condition. And as we go back in time and we start to think about the social norms and the things associated with bulletin boards and bringing people together online, you know, the fast forward to today and social media is a really important topic, and it has major ramifications on society and so much of what's going on in the world today. So it's a very timely program. Those that are watching online as we stream this program, like all, will be stored as part of the permanent collection of the museum. So it's one of those things it's part of the living, breathing CHM that captures things in the physical program, because we all love a campfire and gathering around a forum like this, but at the same time, we want to make sure that it's available around the world and over time with pushing buttons in local language as well. Before I begin the program, though, I'd like to introduce Mark Weber, who will be running the program tonight. Mark has been at the museum for quite some time. He runs the Internet History program here. He's been tracking and monitoring things that have gone on the network since 1995, really since the beginning of commercial, and then obviously the history prior to that. And then others who will be participating tonight, as I mentioned, Dana Boyd, who's a CHM trustee. She's a partner in the Research Institute at Microsoft and MSR, and she's a visiting distinguished scholar at Georgetown. And her focus has always been around data and society and the intersection of technology and society and the social implications of that. I referenced her book called It's Complicated, which goes back about a dozen years or so, but hit very nicely on the New York Times list and is really a definitive book on the topic. Kevin Driscoll, who's an associate professor at the University of Virginia in the Department of Media Studies and also an author of a book called BBS. It's about the modern world, a prehistory of social media. And as the museum does, we grant small awards in various areas over time, and Kevin's book received the prize from the Computer History Museum, which is awarded by the Special Interest Group for Computers, Information, and Society. So the two of them will be on stage with Mark, who will do the moderation. So let me get out of the way and let the program begin. So Mark, Kevin, and Dana, come on up. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Great. Nice to see you. Great.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you so much to Dana and Kevin for joining us. Before we start, let me give you 90 seconds of social orientation. We are communal creatures. As both Kevin and Dana have written, people can make even the stodgiest online systems social, from telegraph operators flirting in Morse code to researchers sending poetry over the ARPANET. By the 1980s, millions of people were online and doing things we do today, from posting tech tips to looking for love, but not on the same system. Early communities were isolated from each other in dozens of incompatible walled gardens. from BBSs to CompuServe to Minitel in France. Much of the content in those gardens was created by users themselves, often character by character over screechy modems. In the early 1990s, the web began connecting everybody together in one giant system over the internet. It was built to be participatory. The first browser was also an editor, like a word processor connected to everything. We'd all be able to create as well as to browse. No fiddling with raw HTML required. But that got derailed early on, as we touch on in our web gallery downstairs. So without authoring built into browsers, there were some serious tries at letting users create their own content on the server side, like wikis and the huge web community GeoCities. But good server-side authoring needs bandwidth and coordination. It didn't go prime time until the early 2000s. When it did, both blogging and social media took off in what was called Web 2.0. Dana chronicled that wave, which unlocked creativity, but also shifted power from users to server owners and to advertisers. It's no coincidence that modern AI was funded and nurtured by the big centralized clouds that grew out of that. Tonight, we'll ask our panelists about the social past and what we might still learn from long-gone online worlds. So Kevin, I had the pleasure of interviewing you here for your previous book on Minitel with Julien Mayan. Could you give us 4 sentences that tell us what your latest book, The Modem World, is about?
So the Modem World is a way to expand the range of stories we tell about where the internet came from and, crucially, how it became social. And so it started from a pretty mundane observation, which is that almost everybody has a fragmentary idea of where the internet came from, but could not really explain how it came to be that we would see a laptop as our primary conduit to all of our social activity, from seeking health information, finding a date, finding a job, chatting with friends. And so I was looking for stories that would fill that gap and explain how we would turn this, computational systems towards these social ends.
I think it's time for our first poll. So what was your experience with BBSs? And I hope as many of you as possible can join on your phones. Give a moment. Okay, so we've got, wow, over half of the audience dialed in.
A wildly unrepresentative sample of the population.
Excellent. We have the right audience.
Yeah. You found your place.
Great. So the second poll then, I'll be very curious for this one. Oh no, it went down. It's interesting to see the live numbers change.
What about the people that don't miss it?
Huh. But the communal feeling people were really fast. And then it sort of went down, which I'm not sure what that says.
It's like a casino game with the little horses.
Anyway, we've got a strong 60% that miss the communal feeling, and only, it's not even on the screen, so small, that don't miss the old communities at all. So then I would like to ask you, Dana, to give a summary, as I asked Kevin, of your work on early social media and your book.
Yeah. So I was one of those people who got to dial in, which was really fun. And part of it is there was this moment, as Kevin's pointing out, where people were really getting excited. And this gets us to the, into the late 90s, and there's all this dream of what the internet as a social space could be. And then the dot-com crash happens. And one of the funny things about the dot-com crash was that there was this split where people were like, "Oh, the internet is all done. It's a fad, it's over." And then there were people, especially out here, who were like, "Oh no, now we can get away from the marketers and we can focus in on like the actual community part of it all, the joy." And so you started to see these imaginations that were coming on. People had been blogging. I mean, a lot of us were blogging from like 96, 97 on, but you started to see new imaginations, new kinds of communities start to pop up. And blogging was one of those spaces that gave people not only the opportunity to express themselves as bloggers, but to tell you about all the other social things that were happening elsewhere. And of course, what happens is that we start to see the rise of what will become social network sites and eventually social media. But it wasn't just that these sites were merging, they were being discussed constantly as the social web was talking about the sites. And so this is the interesting Web 2.0, as you point out, that I spend a lot of time myself documenting, but also just trying to make sense of as these things were emerging.
Excellent. So Kevin, I'd like to ask you about the experience of a BBS user and try to bring that alive for audience members, especially the younger ones. So imagine you're connecting from your new home computer sometime in the 1980s or early 90s. So what did it take to set up in addition to having a personal computer?
Well, the first thing is that personal computers in the 1980s, by and large, were not sold with the required equipment to dial into any sorts of systems because telecommunications wasn't seen as like one of the top applications. So you would have had to intentionally go out and buy a modem, which is the equipment that connects your home PC to a telephone network. And that immediately sets you apart from other computer owners. And simply owning a modem in the 1980s for many people was a mark of distinction. And people talked about being modemers, like you are in on this. It kind of became an inside thing. If you look at survey data from the time, there's pollsters asking people like about what their next computer purchase is going to be. And you can imagine you're going to buy a printer, a joystick, a disk drive. Like you have a lot of things you're going to buy before you get a modem. But once people got them, then they were in. And like when you see survey research on modem owners, they would say, well, now this is indispensable. I will always have a modem. This is why I have a computer, to use the modem. So that's an important part, is as you're going to dial in, you are knowingly entering another space. You're going somewhere that feels new, that feels different, and often felt kind of hidden away, like a secret shared among friends. And I think that feeling is really critical when we revisit like the modem sound that kicked off our event today, because I've started to think about that modem sound. I mean, I've listened to that modem sound too many times, as many of you have also, as a kind of incantation. Like that is calling forth the online world. And if you're doing it from your bedroom, from your home, it's like inviting this online world into your home. You have to transform data into music in order to access this emerging online sphere. So that moment of like entering this arcane list of commands that would bring your modem to life, turn on the dialer, and then just kick off the handshake would be like a moment with a lot of intention in it, which is a big contrast to the way most of us experience online activities today. We don't go online, we are online, like we exist in this perpetual state of onlineness. So that person sitting down to dial their bulletin board, they go through this experience, which I've articulated this very romantic way, and then probably got a busy signal. And if any of you, it seems like some of you were involved in bulletin boards. You have a list of bulletin boards that you call regularly, and you set your modem to dial, and then go in the other room and do something else, and you kind of keep one ear out to hear for when it connects, and then run in and do your thing. Because the thing that distinguishes most dial-up bulletin boards from other sorts of networks is it's one person at a time. It's like a carousel of users who are coming through and communicating asynchronously with one another. And so your experience of using bulletin boards is really this punctuated temporality of like sitting down, waiting, then a burst of activity you got through and you're connecting. I think the other part that it's really interesting is what it's like to call a new bulletin board for the very first time. That experience of being a new user. When you finally do connect, your screen like slowly fills with characters as though the machine on the other end is typing them down the line to you. And then it prompts you, you have to log in. You don't go directly to starting reading messages or downloading files. And often it would say like, are you a new user? You can write guest or new or something. And then you have to fill out a little questionnaire. Who are you? Like, why are you here? What do you plan to do here? And after you fill out your new user questionnaire, it's like, thanks, we'll be in touch. But no carrier, you're done. Because a lot of bulletin board systems felt like house parties, and you're not just inviting like every person that rolls down the street into your home. You want them to say a little bit about what's going on, and you want to communicate to them what the norms and expectations of being in that space are like. So many for bulletin board system software, by default, kept new users at a very limited pace. So then when you finally do get on the board, you have a little sense of what's going to happen there, and you've got some buy-in of why you're there. So just to give a sense of like this day-to-day activity, you weave this bulletin board system activity into your life. Like it's an after-school thing. If you go to school, it's something you do before work or something else. You fit it in around your other commitments that you have.
And once you're in, who would you meet? And would you use your real name or a pseudonym?
Great question. So whether you use your real name or pseudonym would depend on what the vibe of that board is. All bulletin boards had an operator, an owner, known as the system operator or sysop. They set the rules, they enforce the rules, they also run the show, they're responsible for the hardware and software. And some of them say, yes, you have to use your real name. Others don't want any real name. So there's a huge variety of norms that are there. But by and large, you were meeting people who were nearby. And that's true because of the structure of the rates in telephone systems in North America, which is most people subscribed to home telephone service, and then they had flat rate local calling. So you could call people in your town or around as much as you want. So unless you have unlimited money to spend on your BBS hobby, you're going to mostly call nearby bulletin boards. And the users you find there, they might be using pseudonyms. They're people that also probably live nearby. So it could be someone that you run into at the store that you work with. It could be somebody that you become friends with. And lots of bulletin board systems had a online-offline component to the social world. So monthly meetups, go to get pizza, bowling, go to a bar, something like that. Like, kind of if you were part of it, you would take that for granted, but that is a really defining piece of the puzzle, that the people you meet, you could potentially have a kind of offline relationship with. And the other piece is if you lived in a sufficiently densely populated area code with lots of computer owners in it, then there were multiple bulletin boards, and you might be running into the same people on these different boards, but you would interact differently in the different spaces. If there's a board that's about your fantasy baseball league or something, you act one way there, you have a different handle there than you do on another place. Your data, your profile doesn't follow you from one board to the next. You could have very different personalities and expectations of behavior in these two boards, even if it's many of the same people that you're interacting with in those two spaces.
And I did want to ask, so for both of you, what was your first experience online? So Dana, maybe.
So mine was my $700 phone bill when I didn't realize what was actually in the neighborhood or in town and not. That got me in a lot of trouble. And so part of it was that I was that kid. I was, dialing up to a place, a number that I had gotten access. And it all was because my brother was, taking up the phone line, and what was he doing? And I was like, it's made of people? Ooh, I want to play with the people. And, we quickly learned that the answer was to go to bed, and then when we knew our mother was asleep, then we were online. We shared an account, which was actually also really fascinating.
Yeah.
So, there was also sort of like a mutual assured destruction kind of thing, where it's just like somebody could out the other one and be a bad plan. So it was, for me, it was my brother and I, as kids, just trying to make sense of a world that wasn't where we had grown up, which we were both looking for.
I also had a megaphone bill. If my folks are watching, they're like, yep, that was a memorable part of their experience also. A lot of paper route time after that. But if I had like a really distinctive early experience, it was that a local gaming store in town, which was called the Gamers Guild in the town I grew up in Massachusetts, they ran a BBS out of their store. And so the store mostly focused on role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons or tabletop wargaming. And you could become a member, and then you could get access to their calendar and plan games and do stuff, be part of the social world there. And then they just gave everybody an account on the system. And they put 2 PCs in the corner. So if you came in, you got like, I don't know, 30 minutes a day, and you could sit down at the PC and log in, which meant that that bulletin board system had many active users who were not computer owners. Never mind modem owners, they didn't have a PC at home. They could not have access to it any other way. So my first exposure to dial-up bulletin boards was more like walking up to the store and going inside and participating there, and sometimes sitting right next to the person that I was having an online conversation with. So, you know, that was an uncommon experience in terms of like the broader history here, but it definitely set me off with some different expectations on what computer-mediated communication could be like.
I'm also thinking about how so much of the early usage was people who self-identified as geeks, freaks, and queers. And as somebody who identifies all 3, it was like, this is home. But I think about those dynamics, because to your point about the ability to run into each other, right? It's the gamer stores, it's the, it's the places that already were attracting different kind of geeky culture.
Yep.
Or folks who didn't feel at home in whatever environment they've encountered on a day-to-day basis. And so I think this is also part of setting things apart, in the 80s and 90s, because there was a moment where you felt like you had found your people. Mm-hmm. And that sense of identity connection, that sense of communality that was so critical to those early years, versus a world where we're like, oh, everybody's online. So it wasn't as distinct as it was back then.
Yeah.
And that was more important for people not in a big place where they could meet in real life. I mean, that could be a lifeline for people in isolated communities.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I very much think of the internet as my saving grace at every turn, right? And mostly by that point, we're talking spending time on Usenet. Usenet was my really good coming of age in a world where it was actually great to talk to strangers because I could share things without any consequence on what was going to happen at school the next day. That was kind of awesome. And I just remember these wonderful people who I will never know who they are, just holding the young version of me and telling me, it's okay, like there are people that are like you, just get through this school thing and you will find more people like you. And I often come back to that because certainly in the present, it's astonishing to me how many young people don't have people that they can turn to who are like, I got you. And the strangers actually play a really important role for a lot of people coming of age and feeling as though they're part of a world that's bigger than their immediate home community.
So what would, people have gone through the effort of getting a modem, figuring out Hayes commands, maybe dealing with some high phone bills. What would most people do online?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So I think that answer would vary a lot depending on who you ask. So there's some number of people, especially early days, who would use it in the same way that a lot of ham radio operators work. And if you've ever been involved in ham radio, you know the content a lot of the communication is like signal reports, just like we did it. We had some contact, we collect contacts. And so for some people, it's just a big technical challenge. I brought this machine online, and then we're gonna talk about it on itself. It has this like recursive piece. But if you're someone who is looking for community, who is otherwise excluded maybe from other forms of socializing, or is not able to like fully express their emerging self-identity in other places, then you go there to talk about shared interests, talk about problems that you have, to chat with other people. And that forum function, which is baked into the name bulletin board system, is really central to a lot of what happens. And I think what's notable about it is you see many different groups of people kind of reinventing that in different networking environments around the same time. Not that they're mimicking one another, but that this is like such a powerful form of community communication that many people adapt whatever system is at hand to do that.
I think the other thing that's important to remember is how much it was like a gifting economy. People would produce things as a gift for other people. Here is a fan collection of like song lyrics. Mm-hmm. Here are little code snippets that you might find useful somewhere else. And I think about that a lot as we think about the very commercialized web that we're used to now and the battles that are going on around who controls data, because so much of it was, these gifts of time and energy and information as a way of building those connections. So sometimes it was like deeply just outright social and the things that we would think of as like a support network, for example. But people were co-learning, right? They were trying to figure out, I've got this rare disease, how does it work? And they were researching things and they were contributing to it. And it wasn't because I wanted to get paid, and it wasn't for official karma status points. It was more just, part of a different kind of an economy. And that was very present for so many people in those early years.
And so how easy or hard on most systems was it to create, to author, to make something that you could potentially share with others?
I mean, you can think about those years. I mean, the things that by the time we get the web, I know that you were sort of fascinated by, what's this read-only web that starts to emerge. Blogging was a really fascinating dynamic in this because people were learning basic HTML and writing their own manual pages, both to do random topical stuff, but also trying to express different things and keeping these running materials. And I think about those early years, and one of the first sort of famous ones is Justin Hall's link blogs.
Yeah.
And what he was doing was he's just like, I'm going to be like a curator, right? Like I'm just going to collect all these different pieces of information, and I'm going to give it to you so that you have an interesting collection of things to read on a daily basis.
It's how Yahoo started.
It's how, yep. And so all of these pieces start to come into being, and it's really 1999, I often think, for blogging as the big transformation. You get two forked dynamics simultaneously. You have the people who were treating it as a way of building social support networks and community, especially for queer communities, especially for non-white communities. They fork into LiveJournal, right? And LiveJournal becomes this place that's like a real support network, and it's all very, very social within different kinds of taste subcultures. And then you have Blogger, who is going to appear at the same time, that is going to be much more of like, I want to be big and public and connected in different ways and a lot more interest-based. And I think about these two because these are both where you really get to see the ability to write with ease without having to be able to manually make HTML pages. And so I think that in each of our cases, you have these moments that there's a lot of technical ability, and then things start to ease up, and you get both shaped by the tools that come out, but you're also seeing people push at the edge and create different worlds. I don't know how you think of it for...
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about how so far in the conversation, I've been thinking a lot about messaging, forums, like electronic mail, but another hugely important use of bulletin board systems was building archives of software, which could include pirated commercial software, but included a lot of public domain grassroots, like examples of little programs people made to share with one another, a lot of images at a time when displaying images on the screen of your PC was relatively uncommon. And so I found that in a lot of cases, people were seeking files first, and they would hear about bulletin board systems as like a place where you could get free files in a moment where, I mean, we take it for granted now, but like just getting a file from one computer to another was a huge pain in the neck. I mean, a huge problem, especially if you had heterogeneous platforms at work. It was going to be a big problem. Bulletin board systems could function as these like file depots, and people were initially drawn to trade files through these spaces, and then it's like, oh, there's a forum here, and I'm going to chat with people, and then you kind of stick around for these community functions. But if you look at the content of those early files, they expand on other forms of like grassroots creativity that was happening, like fanzines and other kinds of like bottom-up media making that had this computational component to it that would give rise to like hugely influential and wildly creative forms of computing, like the demo scene or music tracking, which are like computer-based forms of art making that existed fully in this bulletin board system-based network of collaborators.
I think that bridge from one to another just kept happening. Like I think about HyperCard, right?
Yes.
As like, one of the things you saw all these, writers and artists trying to, explore and experiment with, nonlinear storytelling. And just then the idea of like, oh, we can actually move this into, what will become hypertext and, as core parts of web. Just the idea of nonlinearity was so mind-boggling as a creative form at that time, which I think is also interesting to think about because it broke open what it meant to be a creator.
Yeah, it was known from games, but really not beyond that much.
Yeah.
My own recollection, I was mostly on the well in the dial-up era. Writing was pretty easy. And on most pre-web systems, you could write text and it was a standard thing to put in. You just post it. It's the web that actually made it difficult, the simple act of writing, that for a number of years that became difficult. So the feeling when all the content you saw was created by other users. Could you just describe how did that feel to people in contrast to even Minitel, which had more commercial content? But what was it like when you're essentially only seeing what your fellow ordinary users are creating?
Yeah, we should imagine it in the context of a cultural moment where people were talking about kill your TV, and your experience of mass communication and mass media seemed like there was no way in. And this is one part of many different forms of participatory media that were in circulation at the time, and being able to share things with other people I think is really critical. And a part of the bulletin board system story that is interesting and like a historical puzzle is that people who created things, whether it was fanzines or software, they really had to relinquish control of the distribution, because once you posted it up on one bulletin board, users would then download it and post it somewhere else, and the files could move a lot farther than the callers would. And so you would have this unknown audience for your work, and I think that did spark a lot of people to try their hand at writing, expressing themselves in that form that they might not have otherwise.
And early personal computers emphasized, the Mac came with McPain and McWrite, et cetera. The idea was that you were creating. It was kind of built into the personal computer. Do you think that carried over into the early dial-up world, that it's you're just expected to make stuff on it?
That's a great question. I'm reminded of this note in the FidoNet, Fido News bulletin that went around, where the editor at the time, Tom Jennings, was like, enough talking about computers. We built this awesome system. Talk about anything else on here, please. Late 1980s, but that was oppression in a moment, because over the next few years, you saw this huge proliferation of boards that were specifically focused on regional queer communities, areas of interest like anime, that you would really want to connect small pockets of people from different places together.
But it's funny, it's the talking about the system, the recursion of that, I feel like it kept happening. Blogging, I cannot tell you how much blogging was about blogging, right? It was just oh my goodness, right? And even in those early days of the social network sites, so much of what people were posting on them was about the system itself. So this is also where it's interesting to think about how norm setting happens within a community, right? The community talks about its own practices, and the well certainly had plenty of that, right? Yeah. So there's also these interesting moments about how do these systems work them out, because it's not just what the technology is put out to do, right? It's how people actually make it as part of their own. And that's in each of these environments, whether we're talking about the distributed BBSs or we're talking different Usenet groups, or all the way up to the social network sites, each of these systems got designed or put out there with one vision. And then you also have these contestations. And I think that's interesting to think about all of the layers of contestations, whether we're talking about the trolls of, rec.pets.cats, which was a whole thing, right? All the way forward to what we're dealing with right now is misinformation. We're seeing these constant tensions over who can control what the narrative is in these environments.
And let's talk about netiquette for a moment. So how did that emerge in the BBS world, and what are some of the, I think we all know from using them that these issues come up, but can you take us through some of the key moments in flame wars and netiquette?
there's jerks wherever you go. But how you deal with it is very different depending on who you are, how well you know one another, what your goals are. And I think, from the research, we know there's over 100,000 different dial-up bulletin board systems all over North America operating like in parallel with each other, where the system operator had total control to experiment with policy and implement policy at the level of software. So rewriting components of the bulletin board to actively, prevent people from using certain words or constrain their speech, how much time they spent online, things like that. So this period really, we can think of it as a period of like widespread experimentation and how to handle these kinds of things. The netiquette notion circulated in the form of text files that people would craft for their own board, and then someone would adopt it and move it across. So there's actually a lot of like documents that would be made and shared between sysops and across to Usenet and into CompuServe forums and other places of like how to handle trolls or what's okay, what's crossing the line, these kinds of things. I don't know that those folks had answers, but they were talking about it a lot.
So they went viral.
But I think the governance issues have been with us at every technology itself.
Yes.
It's not something that's been solved, right? And it's interesting to see, this goes back to the beauty of why we look back historically to grapple with the present. Because so many of these issues, they had ripple effects. Like I often think about my own experiences watching some dynamics on AOL, right? Because one of the things AOL got frustrated with was all of these communities that were talking about disordered eating, anorexia, bulimia. So they created this ban, right? So you couldn't use any reference to these terms. And so what pops up? People start talking about their best friend Anna and their best friend Mia.
Yeah.
And we end up with pro-Anna, pro-Mia inspiration culture in this moment where we're just like, if we just block it, it'll be solved. And it was like, no, 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 it will just keep morphing. And yet we keep relearning that. We're like, well, if we just block, we'll solve all the problems. It's like, oh, you won't, but that's so great you think that. And so I think that this is one of the things that like, going back and thinking about the governance battles then, we are still struggling with these governance issues, but there's a tendency in the dream of always looking forward to not appreciate the lessons that we learned in different evolutions of these systems.
Yeah, and as Kevin brings up in his book, there's a big difference between the system operator that has total control and maybe a paid content moderator today that has very little control and is just cleaning up what an algorithm.
But total control is still...
Yeah.
Well, technical control, technical
Yes.
control.
Yes, but it's still like, this is the weird thing, right? It's like you can still control it, you can shut it down, right? But the thing is that people do what people do, and some of them are jerks.
They do. An interesting part of this total control, and like the best way to think about the total control is who sits near the power plug. And everybody who is involved in BBSs has a story of the sysop just being like, enough, boom, we're off until I feel like it, and I'm just gonna play Doom for the next 3 days or something. Or I have to do homework and the system goes down. But like that form of control is very limited in a sense because the barriers to creating a new bulletin board system are very low relatively to Facebook. Like creating a new Facebook is a little bit of a high barrier. But if the sysop or other people are being a jerk or the system is becoming unwelcoming in some way, someone else could start their own bulletin board using their own PC, their own phone line, and then invite other people to move over. So there is kind of like a push and pull to that total control once you look outside the limits of that space.
Well, and I feel like we have to move this forward to see this, because you're thinking about the big commercial entities, but some of these dynamics also rippled into the future. I think about Forchan, right? Chris Poole, who created Forchan in the logic of a teenage boy, which meant that it was for anime and porn, and it was in his parents' house. He didn't want to admit that he was doing this. So the result is that he sort of coded it up so that when something would disappear off of the top page of it, it would just get erased because he didn't have the server space to be able to manage this, which of course is the origin of a lot of our contemporary meme culture, right? Which is just repost it and keep going. He lost control of the system, and he admits it. He was like really struggling with what was going on here, especially during a period that's usually referred to as Gamergate. And so the result is he blocks huge chunks of this, right? Tries to take it down, tries to get rid of it, what happens? A duplicate site gets created called HN that's just, you know, one of those like anything goes, right? And so then we get a whole new form of toxicity. So I think that this total control thing, you know, it plays differently when we're talking about, you know, a public company and the politics of money, but also in a lot of these environments where people have the plug, they walk away and it just spawns a new version.
So what kind of crazy person would want to run a bulletin board and own it? What was a typical system op?
Well, apparently we have like a tremendous number of former sysops here, more than gathered in
What
many
kind
years.
of enlightened individual would wish to
Yeah, what kind of like
create
special,
the
cool
nexus
person
of a
would do
wonderful online community?
I mean, so I think a lot of people, and you know, generalizing broadly, like a lot of folks were interested in how bulletin board systems worked. Many bulletin board systems in their file area had bulletin board system host software for download, so you could try it out and run it and take your hand, or you thought, I can do it better. But many of the more interesting bulletin board systems that lasted for a long time had a connection to some other social organization. So it's like you have a club and you build a bulletin board to extend the club so you can keep in touch between meetings, or you have a certain interest that you're trying to elaborate, or you're trying to build a portal into some other network or something like that, and you have this purpose for this bulletin board system existing. So do we know what the sysop type is? I'm not sure. Probably there's a few different sysop types, and there's probably some really funny like FAQs that talk about what the different types of sysops are.
Field guide to system operators.
Yeah, but they do have to have a unique combination of skills because it does have this technical and social, and in many cases, economic responsibility. They also have to pay the phone bill. And if the hard drive dies, they probably have to buy another one. So another form of experimentation that you see in these systems is around how to make them sustainable. And a lot of BBS sysops would joke about how they pay their own bills in contrast to the admins of like a Usenet node. Or it was like you're kind of packaged into a bigger computer science department budget or something.
So what was the business model for most, if there was
I don't think
any?
I don't think I could say for most, but the range of experiments is really interesting. So you can imagine the per hour form of billing, like you get so much time. There's per byte usage, so if you're doing a lot of transfers, you're paying more. There was the example like the gaming store I mentioned where I was paying a membership for a whole range of things and the bulletin board system was one piece of it. There's more ad hoc, pass the hat kind of things that were going on, but some of the really interesting things that would happen later was how to pay, because the options for electronic payments were so limited. So how do you give me the money? Like, do we have a party at my house and everybody drops $5 in a bucket? Or like, how do I get the money from you? So at one point in time, there was bulletin board system software that supported this method of payment where you would register a 1-900 toll number. Your users, when they ran out of time on the system, could call the 1-900 number and put in their user ID or a PIN number or something. And then somewhere, that would update the database and say you paid, and then you've got a toll on your phone bill at the end of the month for that 1-900 call. It's like a crazy workaround for this kind of thing. I mean, a Rube Goldberg machine for payments. So that builds a contrast to something like Minitel, where payment is like baked in from the beginning. But it forced people to really experiment around how to do this and to talk a lot about money, like how much it costs to build an online community and keep it running.
So what kind of person would dial into a smaller BBS as opposed to joining CompuServe or Prodigy, The Source, Genie, some of the more formal online services?
Yeah, my impression is that a lot of people would be doing both. And so if you were interested in CompuServe, you could learn about CompuServe or The Source more easily than you would learn about the dial-up bulletin board systems in your area, because your initial encounter with bulletin boards would have to come through a friend, a sibling, another person in your life who had that experience. Some small computer stores would have a literal bulletin board with like a piece of paper that had a list of bulletin boards to call, electronic bulletin boards to call. But many people remember going onto CompuServe or the source and downloading a list of bulletin boards organized by area code, and then either, if the money was the issue, they might no longer pay for the commercial service. Now they have this list of boards and they're off and running. So it's a tricky question because I think people are pragmatic about how they spend their time and money and would move between these spaces to try to fill different needs.
Let's jump to what is the difference between an online community and a social network?
Right, so there's a lot of different social practices, right, from the origins of the web. But what starts to emerge, you got blogging and people are actually creating their own little pages in that world. And out of that, you also are at the same time starting to see online dating sites, right? These are happening around parallel. The thing about an online dating site is that you would create a profile of yourself, right? And you would sit there and market yourself, in the hopes that you would find somebody of interest to you. And so here we are, the dot-com crash happens, and the only thing that's really making money is these online dating sites. And so people start asking questions of what's a better way to do an online dating site? And this is where you start to see old ideas start to merge together into one. And up pops what, at the time we referred to as the social network sites. And the key with a social network site is that it started with a profile. It started with something that looked like a dating site. It was like, here's who I am, here's information about myself. And sometimes that information about yourself, unlike the dating site, it looked a lot more like what was in an AOL profile at the time. And you mix that with this new opportunity, which was to be able to identify all the people that you also know. And this, again, pulls from blogging, because there were blog roles as a really common thing, which was like, here are the recommended other sites to see. So you had these mixtures of features that start to come into this. And in many of these sites, certainly with Friendster and MySpace, you would have these ability to update little pieces and put things on your site. And again, this is not the first even social network site. You can go back to 6 Degrees, and that existed. But this comes together at a particular moment. And there's multiple sites that start to pop up. Some are designed for dating. In fact, Friendster was supposed to be a dating site. It didn't really work out that way. Others were supposed to be a business site. Rise was a very odd one because it was supposed to be a business site and quickly turned into a site for older white guys to hook up with young Asian women. That was a whole thing. It was a little awkward. LinkedIn sort of responded to this by having no pictures, right? That was part of its response to it. So there's all of these experiments that start to emerge. What's interesting at that moment, right, if you think about Friendster as sort of one of the earliest versions of this, is that the founders lost control of the site, right? They thought they were designing a dating site, and here they have all these burners having a field day, making up their burner profiles and connecting to everybody and taking this into the playa in August. You also have a world of gay men who are like, how do I list everybody I know so that I can find somebody who's 4 degrees away that I probably haven't slept with, which was like a whole culture in itself. And so the founders were struggling to control this. And they were also ill-prepared for the technical costs of maintaining this thing. And so this thing was crashing all the time, which created all these room for other things to pop up. Mm-hmm. And there were ones that popped up under specific languages. There were ones that popped up, in really weird ways. Like my favorite was, Orkut. I don't know if anybody remembers Orkut. But Orkut had a really odd design decision in how it built things, where it had this sort of leaderboard, again, something that had pulled from other things. It had a leaderboard by country, and it had the country flags on it. Well, the thing is that the presentations of that site ironically looked like a World Cup presentation. And so the result is you ended up in this crazy competition that Brazil was like, we know how to win at this. Like, we win at World Cup, we will win at this leaderboard too. And so then you're suddenly in this world where it's like, how did this site get taken over by Brazilians? And so that was also part of these environments where it's just different cultural norms were moving across all of these at the same time.
It's time for our third poll. How often did you check your email in 1998? An email was a very social function, as we all know, and it was sort of the messaging that went with a lot of websites. So what's our, we'll give people a moment to dial in. Not yet born, still pretty far up there. And daily, in the middle, there's not much. Multiple times a day.
Yeah.
I think this was a very, very wired crowd. And what communities were you active on? And let's, not just 1998, but this goes over a range of the topics we've covered.
Boom.
They're fighting it out. There's no rivalries here.
Can you scroll up so we can see the bottom?
Mark does. Oh, yeah, okay.
Wow, others. I'm surprised. Those, huh.
Now I'm curious what all the others
We must
are.
not have gotten the right ones.
Open response question at the bottom.
Next time, we'll choose differently. But we've got Usenet as a clear winner, which shows this is a very wired crowd, and others. So that's our last audience poll, but in a bit we will switch things around and turn to your questions for the panel. So start submitting yours now if you have not already. You can click the Q&A tab on the Slido page to do that. So what was your first social medium?
So I think the biggest problem for me is it has to do with definitions, right? And so we retroactively start labeling things social media, but that term as a concept is not really appearing.
No, but you came up with a wonderful definition.
What was my wonderful definition at the time? That would be great.
That you
See, this is
could
the
have
problem with writing on the
a
internet.
profile
That's the
and
social network
see who you
sites.
were connected to.
That was the social network site.
Sorry, I should say social network. What was your first social network?
So, I mean,
Oh,
I was
I'm
on
sorry.
6 Degrees, I was on Friendster, like, I actually got out of control on signing up for all of them. I don't know that there's a single one that I wasn't on for many, many years. I don't know, where did you start on that?
On those sorts of sites, I also would just sign up for everything that came down the
know.
pipe. I was like, I feel like Friendster was the first time that I was connecting with a lot of people who weren't like computer friends.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, the most profound shift in my habits was living on campus at a college and having AIM, having AOL
Yeah.
Instant Messenger, independent of the AOL client. And I have this like very distinct sense memory of being outside on like a beautiful spring day, students doing student things. People have their like sound system pushed against the window and they're playing music, probably pirated MP3s on Winamp. And then you would just hear like thundering across the campus, the sound of a creaking door open or close. Because it was the people like signing on and off of their buddy list on AOL, just blaring on top of the music. So that was a pretty distinct change in my social behavior because you could make plans with people and you treated it like an electronic answering machine. It wasn't like live chat.
The funny thing about AOL is, I remember when the Sidekick came out, which I can still do that clicking movement. And I remember at some point looking at the data, and it was something like 1/3 of all messages shared back and forth on AOL Instant Messenger on AIM were done by the Sidekick, which is because the Sidekick people were just so obsessive the entire time.
Yes.
And that was like such a big deal. But I think part of the other thing I would say with your social media, social network site mix-up, I think part of it is to remember that social media was when we started really also thinking about just straight up consumption. And I think this is another interesting tension that we're living with to this day, which is that the early social network sites were genuinely social. There were definitely parasocial environments where you would follow somebody and you'd be like, they're amazing, right? And it would be that fandom feeling. which was really important. But there was a lot of, you would participate in order to consume. Like it was very much connected. You were not just a lurker, you were not just an absentee participant. And what we've really done in the more recent years with the different layers and layers of genres of social media is we've moved back to a world that's much more like television, right? Like, I mean, TikTok and YouTube, yes, they've got social features, yes, they've got comments, all these other things, but most people just consume. And I think that's really interesting. And I often think about this even in relationship to the iPhone, right? Because the iPhone makes it a lot easier to consume than to produce text. And so for a lot of people, as those apps started pulling in, yes, they would make some videos and they would do different things, but you switch slower and slower into a consumption mode. Then it was actually really common, certainly with things like Sidekick or things that were very easy to produce. And so I think we also have to deal with the ebbs and flows of that in different kinds of media.
It's a flat screen TV in your pocket.
It is. It is. And the earliest versions of it, trying to communicate, like even text messaging on that thing was just darn near infuriating. And so, because it was meant to be visual. And of course, we would pop up things like, the different kinds of, let's say, Instagrams and all of their variants would appear. But social media, I think it's also notable that we have these certain patterns that move. The other pattern that happens is that we have these really public environments, and then we go really private, like email or mailing lists. We lock down, and then we go back to being public. So we have these flows. And we also have the flows of like massive contribution or massive just watching. And those flows continue, to intersect in interesting ways with each new genre of these systems.
And before
I was
we've
going
got
to say also just one interesting twist on it is when you look at the way that popular media was talking about the information superhighway in the early 1990s, it wasn't the writerly experience that we're describing of having long threads on Usenet or even like hilarious flame wars with people in some space or just chatting late into the night. It was interactive TV. And like TV plus computer plus satellite, like there was a way of imagining it. And it's not surprising that cable became such like an important wireline infrastructure because it was turning television into a more interactive, personalized medium.
Well, and that was always the more commercial option. Even back then, that was the thing of making money, that was advertisements. And so we also have that connected to the economic commitments.
But making it harder for people to author and to write, first with a lack of authoring on browsers, then with phones that are mostly designed for maybe Twitter length authoring at most. That certainly, I think, plays a role. I mean, there's a push toward commercialization, but also when it's actually physically hard to contribute, that doesn't make it easier. But that's me pontificating.
So I think part of it is there's certain devices and certain technologies where I think that's true. But there's also the narrative and how these narratives are coming down and telling you what this thing is for. Especially when you're trying to learn these systems, you're socialized into that narrative, right? And look, if you think about young people even growing up during the COVID era where please give you a device as a babysitter, right? They are socialized into this as a consumption media.
As a parent, we never did that.
Congratulations, miracle. But this sort of consumption first narrative, like it is interesting to see that continues on, even at an age where like we don't expect a 3-year-old to be producing, but they're socialized into a world of consumption.
That's true.
I have to like play devil's advocate
Please.
a little bit, which I hate doing, but I
Oh, no.
do think when we talk about producing, we have a very specific idea in mind of what that looks like an ideal form of interaction. But there's nothing easier than looking into my selfie camera and pressing record and just speaking. And actually that makes participation a lot more accessible to different people in different ways. The distribution mechanism through the platform doesn't necessarily serve maybe democratic ends or the ends that are community-defined ends. It serves like the needs of a very narrow group of people. But the production has shifted for sure away from writing in some ways, but does enable other forms of communication that we couldn't have had under other circumstances. So we can imagine like all of these as a range of possibilities that could be combined in ways that we haven't tried yet, that have elements of some of these earlier, more writerly systems, but maybe some of the accessible production mechanisms of TikTok or Instagram or something.
Well,
like that.
I think you're right to decouple them. Like, children are producing selfies at a very young age.
Yes.
They're just hopefully not sharing them.
Correct.
Right? Like, their parents are. That's a whole other thing. But then there's other moments when I agree with you that the ability to take pictures and do that and sharing it was, I mean, so much easier than it was when you and I were younger. I think that the difference is also what kind of expectation do you have to contribute in order to be an active participant?
Yeah.
Right? And if you think about the culture of TikTok, you don't need to produce TikToks every day to be a part of it. Whereas like with Friendster, you had to make a profile. Like you couldn't participate in that environment at all, even as a consumer, unless you were contributing at the base minimum. And I think that's also what's, again, these different kinds of design decisions and these kinds of environments where it's like, what kinds of contributions are required to even be in the room? And this goes back to your point about like having to say that you exist, right? Like that's an important part of it. You don't have to say that you exist to watch YouTube videos.
Absolutely not.
So well, I will, if we have time at the end, think about it for a moment. I was going to ask, what can we learn from the past to improve the social future? So think about that. Don't answer now. So, this is from an audience member, as a teenager who found a community via BBSs and forums without worries about safety, how do parents let their kids find that same freedom and community now? Either of you.
I mean, this is a point of anxiety. It's interesting to see how moral panics are entirely entangled with different technologies at different times. And I point this out because I think that if my mother had any clue what I was actually doing, she would be completely panicked, right? And I look back with joy and wonder, but it was her cluelessness that in many ways was helpful for me. And then part of it is that this current crop of people, like they imagine the worst. They understand what this is. They've been narrated into like all of these horror stories. And it doesn't matter what the data say. And that's one of the painful things I will say at this moment where we're going through a whole conversation of what I will call an anxious parent generation. Because we're at a point right now where parents imagine all of the worst and they project that onto what's going on with their kids. And their kids are really constrained in what kind of opportunities they have. I would say the data that's been keeping me up at night lately has to do with non-custodial adults. So it was something I started tracking with my research, which was how much access does a typical young person have to non-custodial adults? These are the aunties and the coaches and the pastors and all of the people that are not parents. And these are people that you might have met, doing World of Warcraft. These are people that you connected in different ways and played different roles in making sure you were okay. And the thing that's interesting is that this is very much tethered to the inability to get out and be a part of public life in general, which is that young people's access to non-custodial adults has just decreased and decreased and decreased. And the thing that is just keeping me up at night is that it completely ruptured during COVID, such that today's young people have fewer access to non-custodial adults than ever. And it's not returned. And so I point this out because one of the things as a parent, for the parents out there, is like, how do you actively cultivate the ability to engage with non-custodial adults in your life? How do you start with the trusted aunties? How do you trust with the people that are there? But also, how do you socialize young people into an online environment where that's actually totally kosher, right? And gaming was often a pathway for people, where it's just like, you don't need to know everything about somebody's life to go and do a raid with them. And that was fine. But we've created such strange constraints and such control dynamics right now that I think that that's, hard to watch. But is it going to be ever like what we grew up with? No. It's going to be different. And that's also hard because what are the new forms and the new environments that are going to be able to go there? And I think we have to just start with actually thinking at the meta place, not thinking about the technology, but thinking about what are the social structures that young people have and where does technology then fit in?
Kevin, do you think the emerging dark forest, in quotes, private internet spaces like Discord are recapturing early net modem culture, or are they a continuation of big social?
Oh, that's an interesting distinction. One thing is clear, many people, so to clarify what we're talking about is people building smaller more closed off spaces that could be Discord servers, Mastodon, just group chats with select groups of friends or maybe strangers. Sometimes we talk about that as like a dark forest. And one notable thing is people thinking about that are looking back at earlier systems to try to get a sense of what's possible. So I don't think they're recreating the dynamics exactly, but they're explicitly like trying to build new models, like new examples of what could be possible. And in some cases, they do recreate or find inspiration from some of these earlier systems. And that's promising because that's different than the ways that people had been thinking about building social systems for a while, which was on one hand either like onward, progress, forward, the next thing is better than the previous thing, or people who, like, it's always important to remember that an overwhelming majority of people who use the internet today did not use it prior to the platform era. They started using the internet for everyday life. And I don't mean like obligations for work or school or something like that. After 2008, with a mobile first, always on high bandwidth, platform-based internet. So they would identify problems and then start from scratch, trying to think about what the next thing would be. So it's encouraging that people who are engaging in these like new, smaller spaces are looking for examples of what might have happened before and what's still surviving. You know, we talk about the Well or Echo or even Metafilter or Slashdot. Like these big, thriving communities carry on in sometimes surprising and unpredictable ways.
Then this plays into an interest of ours here. What historic BBS content do you wish you could access or analyze? Are there any useful archives of BBS content from the 80s and 90s? And this is something I've asked you privately. It's very difficult. Here at the museum, we have one of the best collections of networking historical materials in the world, but it's a fraction of what was there, and often not the content, the conversations. But I'll let you guys.
Yeah, I mean, when I was getting, like learning how to do research, I learned a lot from television and radio historians because, especially for people studying early broadcasting, they didn't expect to find recordings because there was no recording equipment to be had. So they used other texts, interviews, critical materials to try to like triangulate what had been going on. So we have to do that, number one, like accept that much of this online interaction is ephemeral. But the other like really critical piece is that there is a lot of material that's saved, but it's saved through the volunteer labor of enthusiasts, amateur preservationists, hobbyists, and other folks in informal spaces that are often outside of institutions. And to make those sustainable, we need more institutional attention to turn towards the work of amateur preservationists. So like the archive that was most valuable to me in doing this work is textfiles.com, which was created by Jason Scott in the process that led up to him doing a documentary about bulletin board systems. The documentary came out in 2005. The archival project was kind of contemporary with the thriving bulletin board systems. It wasn't a retrospective project initially, although it is now, being a bridge into the web and this kind of file-oriented saving. So there is a lot of material to be had, but there is not a lot of guidance or support or infrastructure or funding, frankly, to make that possible. So that's something that I think.
And if any of you have materials of historical interest, let us know.
And I'll say with my trustee hat on, if any of you have any resources to help support this, please let us know as well.
Indeed. And so what do you think are the best fictional depictions of the BBS culture of the 80s and early 90s, and why?
Ooh.
I mean, I still go back to Hackers. Angelina Jolie helps, but like that film and the way that just sort of invited an imagination of a whole, cohort of people, that the idea of geekiness as coolness. I mean, I think this is also what we keep coming back and talking about who was and wasn't online. Like, it was geeky, right? And there are still new geeky spaces in all of this. And so we talk about these technologies that are mainstream, and we forget that in like the 80s and 90s, like, we were not mainstream, right? But there's something joyous about like seeing geeky culture be celebrated? I don't know. What comes for you?
Yeah, I mean, clearly like war games is an influential depiction of like modeming for fun or like subversive play, but I don't think there's anything as great for 1980s bulletin board systems as there was for 1970s citizens band radio culture. And there's so much like continuity between the kinds of like playful interactions that people were having in CB radio as they would later in bulletin boards. And of course, like the chat system on CompuServe was called CB Simulator. It's like a very explicit connection. But like Smokey and the Bandit or Citizens Band, there's really great film from the 70s that operates through the like weird, nearby but anonymous world of person-to-person like Citizens Band radio.
And an audience member wrote that we've talked mostly positively about early dial-up and less positively about modern social. Was there, if I understood correctly, was there a dark side to the modem world?
Yeah, lots. Right? I mean, this is a phenomenon that encompassed like several million people doing things on many smaller systems. But the simplest one is just, while the barriers to entry to creating bulletin board systems were low, it was low relative to insurmountable barriers for institutional kinds of systems. But it was really high relative to what it takes now to like create community space for you and your people online. And so the kinds of the kind of people that you would encounter, while they were really colorful and fascinating, did draw from like a pretty narrow band of life. Like if we're talking about in the United States, it's predominantly white, it's predominantly upper middle class people, for a long time predominantly people who identified as men. And so despite the flourishing of queer cultures in these spaces, that happened against a backdrop of like, pretty much homogeneity. So I would never trade the kind of like inclusive online spaces that I experience today for that, despite there being some advantages and things about those early systems that I think had a lot of merit.
Well, I also think about Jesse Daniels' work tracing white nationalists through the entire time, right? White nationalists were really, really involved in those early days and in the worst toxic recruiting ways possible. And I think about also the ways in which we talk about contemporary issues of disinformation or contemporary issues of trolling. These were also present, right? The number of people pretending to be doctors and setting people up for real emotional torment, like you'd hear these moments of just destroyed lives in different ways. So I think it's also, I can be nostalgic about like any one of these systems because I think that part of it is to remember that every system had its moments of joy, its moments of beauty, the moments of connection and learning and all of the things that we think of in the social world, right? The beauties of humanity. And every one of these things had the darknesses that you could imagine of different kinds of social configurations. What happens when people come together? What happens when interests collide? They all played out in every one of these systems. And this gets, of course, connected to your contemporary point, which is that we have a tendency to go to these polarities, and we really need to resist that because there's not any technology is good or bad. It's both. And I always come back to this sort of argument that I've been making, which is the internet mirrors and magnifies the good, bad, and ugly, right? All at once. And so, I think that it is, when I think about those social network sites, I think about blogging, like there was so much community there. So I don't want to leave people with some sense that those were all dark. I think that they also had such beauty to them.
And there were, for instance, we interviewed some of the creators of Net Noir, which was a very important AOL and then a website.
Yep.
And then Black Planet was a very important early social site. Those seem to have that energy was subsumed into Black Twitter in some ways. But I mean, do these online communities all sort of just get absorbed into the Borg, or is that in fact better to have their own identity within something bigger?
I think it's important to remember, I mean, Black Planet, Mihante, like a lot of these sites that were niche they weren't as nearly as large as any of the other big things. There are still niche groups all over the web. We just don't pay attention to them when we pay attention to the big beasts. And so what happens is that there's a breaking point for them where it's just like when you have an identity population who's coming online, they're now moving to the big places, but there's still amazing networks that are small that, I think we should acknowledge continue to grow. And this is the whole part of like, where you see Discord channels or where you see all of these other subgroups. So I think it's important to realize that we're living with mainstream systems, and because technology is so visibly has the mainstream systems, we're not paying as much attention to the niche systems, but they still exist, and they're probably bigger than they were in the 80s and 90s. It's just that we just don't pay attention to them because they're not billions of people, like you think of the big folks. And this goes back to the CompuServe and. Many people that are on these niche networks are there and a mainstream system, right? So the thing is we pay attention to them when they're on the mainstream system rather than the interesting, weird network that they've got on the side that's only like a couple of thousand people.
Yeah, just the way that memes might emerge in a 4chan environment, then be reproduced on Reddit, turn up on Facebook. Like, people came up with weird jokes on the OKPlayer message board that then were picked up in Black Twitter and circulated and came back down and were shown on TV and mentioned in other places. But it is a super interesting scale issue, which is that we very easily slide into accepting metrics that are specific to the needs of venture capital funded firms. Like, they need to show growth, and they measure growth in very peculiar ways. And those ways don't necessarily match what we feel or what we experience as a thriving, healthy community. We might measure that in different ways if we came up with metrics for doing that. So some of the numbers are so big that they start to tip over the edge of our cognitive capacity to reason with them. So you might as well say there's a gazillion users on this thing. Whereas if you said to someone in 1990, there's this space online and there's 20,000 people participating in it routinely, you'd be like, whoa, that's huge. That 20,000 people are coming back time and again, and that would be a rounding error off of some of the things that we're talking about now. So I think engaging with some of those numbers can be really powerful at undoing some of that expectations and allowing you to surface or see some of the really important spaces that still exist.
So we need to wrap up. But I do want to get your thoughts on what can we learn from older communities, both all dial-up. Dial-up really went to about 2010. But both BBSs and earlier forms of social and just plain old online communities. What are the lessons that we could apply today, if any?
Yeah, I mean, the things that I'm doing with some of my historical work is about showing there have always been multiple internets. By definition, it is a rollicking network of networks, and that means nothing that has come is predetermined, and another form of internet is still possible. We have not foreclosed the potential for very radically different networks to be formed.
I think, when I think about a lot of the work that I did even on the social network sites, is to remind ourselves that we build relationships and networks all over the place. And we have to attend to them. We have to maintain them. We have to think about those relationships. And many of these systems, again, because of scale, are trying to push you into just growing as many relationships as possible. If we learned anything out of COVID, this is a way to destroy our weak ties. So I think going back to thinking about how do we attend to our relationships and and this is what a lot of those older systems were about, because it wasn't just how big can you get? It was how do I be a constant, active, and meaningful contributor to community? And I think that that's something to learn back to this as we go through the next phase of it. It's what does it mean to think about contributions to a community that are not just about how to make money or how to extract data in different ways, but really thinking about how to be a part of a giving circle.
Wonderful. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, for sure, thank you. I'm struck by a couple of things. oftentimes I think about the Computer History Museum, we say CHM, Computer History Museum. But I also oftentimes think, and some of you have heard me say this, that it's computing humanity and meaning. And the lens by which we need to do everything at the museum is to answer the question of what it means to be a human in a world that does not exist without computing. And I think this conversation, when you start to think about the very nature of the human condition, it brings to mind a couple of thoughts. One is, I think David Byrne was right. It's the same as it ever was. and I think that there's no question that the technology that empowers this capability is political because it exerts power. And the concentration of power, whether it's financial or what have you, is central. And I think these panelists and Mark's questioning and all of your questions sort of exemplified, a world that is going to be ever-changing, no question about that. But it's going to be built on a foundation of the human condition and what people are looking for or not. And other than that, I just want to take my hat off to Denny Hayes. How many people remember Denny Hayes? Because, obviously he invented the modem, and it also is representative of that moment in time when it was a very special thing to be able to connect and listen to those little screeches. So thanks again, everyone. And thanks for coming tonight. Great.